Let me pray for us. Lo, you abhor not the virgin's womb. This is mysterious, great God, and difficult to understand. Would you teach us something of what it means tonight? Some of us here are skeptical and we're not sure what to make of this story. Others of us here are apathetic. We could really care less. Some of us here come excited, rejoicing, celebrating the most important story in the world, and it's the most important story to our lives. We ask that whoever we are, in whatever state we are in, as you invaded this world some 2,000 years ago, you would invade our hearts now by the power of your Spirit. For Christ's sake. Amen. Well, I was out last night, and the streets were buzzing. The last-minute shoppers were all around. You're not going to see that many people normally on at least 6 o'clock on a Friday evening filling the shops, last-minute shoppers. On the way home, the streets were packed. The expressway was, the highway was, the 101 was jammed. People traveling. The city was really abuzz. Perhaps you noticed. And everyone was greeting one another, most with a smile, some not. People start doing some strange things during the holidays, right? I mean, I was in not Macy's, but the other one, and basically there was a Great Dane in the middle of the store, but everyone just sat there with a smile, even when the Great Dane was jumping at them. And they would say to each other and to the Great Dane, "Happy holidays." Happy holidays, that's what we say at this time. But there was a time when it wasn't a holiday, it was a holy day. From the first century, Christians have been actually celebrating the birth of Christ. And from at least the 3rd century, Christians have been meeting on this day, this evening, and tomorrow morning to celebrate the birth of Christ. And back then, they were doing it pretty much by themselves. A marginalized group which nobody knew about. Their services weren't public, nobody was off from work. But they would meet and they would have a feast together. A group of people that weren't very wealthy would have a large feast. Why? See, before Christmas has become what it was or what it's become now, there were these Christians that would meet and they would give gifts and they would celebrate and they would feast as the world passed by. Why? What is Christmas all about? I mean, originally, what was it all about? Well, it's about the fact that God came to earth, that He invaded our planet, that the infinite God was contracted to a span. And in the text before us, Paul gives us at least some of what all that mean, the details. He tells us when He came, He tells us how He came, and He tells us why He came. So let's look at that and get something of the meaning of Christmas together tonight. First, He tells us when He came. And He came when it was just the right time. And what was the historical context into which Jesus came to earth, into which He was born? What were the circumstances in the world in which He came? Well, first, there was the Greeks. Some 300 years before Jesus was born, Alexander the Great had set out conquering most of the Mediterranean world. And in so doing, when he did that, he actually united them. People from all different ethnicities and backgrounds, he united them into a common culture. And the glue that held that culture together? The Greek language. The lingua franca. It was the time that when you would go and you would trade, and for international diplomacy, everyone could speak the same language. Kind of like English is today. And so people could communicate from folks all over the Mediterranean world. Well, there was the Romans as well. 500 years before the birth of Christ, the Romans set forth a transportation revolution that nothing has actually been able to surpass. Roads, and more roads scattered throughout the Mediterranean world. In fact, they went so far that it would even expanded into what is modern-day northern England. Pam and I lived close to some of these roads. Crazy. They're still around. Paved roads all around so that people could pass by. And of course, they were mainly, or one of the reasons, is for the expansion of the Roman Empire and for the military. And so because of that, these roads were protected. People could travel with great ease. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, was something that had been instituted under the reign of Caesar Augustus, which meant it was a time of relative peace and safety, harmony. So people could pass by all around. This is the world into which Jesus was born. Paul says, he writes, that when the fullness of time had come, verse 4, God sent his Son. You see, history unwittingly was preparing for the birth of Jesus Christ. But while history might have been anticipating or preparing for his birth, history did not produce or determine his birth. See, because Paul doesn't write that when the fullness of time had come, Jesus came. He writes that in the fullness of time, when the fullness of time had come, God sent. You see, Jesus isn't the product of natural cause and effect, and he's not the end of a long equation of time plus chance. This isn't just a bunch of circumstances that came out and then voila, there was Jesus. No, God sent. See, it was just the right time because it was God's time, the time God had chosen. Because the thing you need to understand is that Jesus is God, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. He is not determined by history. He determines history. That's the God we're talking about. That is actually the kind of stuff we are dealing with when we talk about Christmas. And Jesus not only came when it was just the right time, he also came, Paul writes, when we were enslaved. In verses 1 through 3, he paints this analogy, that was very prevalent in the Roman world. He says, there was this child, and when a child, before they've reached their age of maturity, let's say 18 for our culture, before they've reached that, they're basically no different than a slave because they don't have their inheritance yet. And while the analogy breaks down, and Paul knows that, it's not perfect, his primary point comes through in verse 3. Before Christ came, we were enslaved to the elementary principles of this world. And freedom is something that our culture values very, very much. It's an inalienable right? Just like life. We'll protect it, we'll promote it, but the one thing that we don't really do is we don't question it. Well, what do we mean by freedom? What constitutes freedom? Am I really free? I think if most of the time, if we were to ask, well, what do we mean by freedom? And freedom, as I think we define it today, is basically a person should have the ability to define and to determine what is true for themselves and what path they should take in life. In fact, this view was actually enshrined in a 1992 Supreme Court ruling, very famous one, where the Supreme Court writes, and I quote, The heart of liberty is to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and the mystery of human life. Supreme Court. And see, it's against this background, this view of freedom, that Christianity, many reject Christianity and organized religion, especially because that is seen as simply an obstacle to our personal freedom. It's a restrictive, right? Because it actually tells you who you are, and it tells you what to do. And so anything like that is an affront to my freedom. And so people reject Christianity. But here's where things get interesting. Because Paul's clear presupposition is a conviction that outside of submission to Christ, outside of Christianity, slavery is the universal human condition. You see, we say unless or if you follow Christ, if you follow Christianity, then you won't be free, you'll be enslaved. Paul says, no, actually it's just the opposite. If you don't submit to Christ, you're enslaved. Interesting. See, what the Bible does is it calls our whole notion of freedom into question. And I think it's right to do so. Let me just give you two examples of why. First, when we're defining freedom, we tend to think that freedom, again, if it's I can do whatever I want and should be able to do whatever I want, it's freedom from any kind of boundaries or rules. But of course, that's an absurdity. Have you ever tried to play like a game without rules? You don't get anywhere. You're not really free to play. I was able to watch this afternoon. I was able to watch the 49ers play, which is a good year to be a 49ers fan. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, what if all these guys lined up and they just said, like, okay, no rules. Let's just play. All of a sudden, 20 guys are on the field, and you're like, first there's 22, and then some people are like, well, hey, this is even. Let's get some more people on the field. And they're like, wait, we're outnumbered. So then they bring some more, and pretty much the whole team from both sides are on the field. And then they're like, I mean, there's no rules, right? So nothing to say that there's only 11 people on the field. And then we're like, well, what about the fifth man, right? The crowd. So they crowd the field, and right, everybody comes out. And what are we going to do? Well, we just know that we've got to score more than you. But of course, that's a rule. If you establish that, it's like, how much playing of football would go on? None. It's absurd. It's absurd to think that this idea that freedom is a lack of rules. No, freedom is actually being able to have rules in the proper context. The question is not whether or not we have rules, it's what rules we have. But secondly, and more to Paul's point, is this: we all live under influences. We're enslaved because we all live under certain influences, both internal and external. I mean, think about it. Paul writes, he says that we're enslaved to first the elementary powers of this world in verse 3. And in verse 5, he tells us that one of those powers is even the law. The law. Now think about this for a second. I mean, what Paul is saying is that everybody is enslaved. That's the universal condition. Now, here's why I think that's true. Let's just think about this for a second. Most people can agree, there are certain things, like even though the borders are fuzzy, most people are going to agree on pretty much what's right and wrong, right? I mean, things like this. Most people will agree you're not supposed to murder other people, okay? It's kind of universal. All religions kind of say that. Most people can agree that, you should treat other people with dignity and respect. Most people would agree that you shouldn't really steal from people and such. Right? Or that you should be a person of integrity. Most people agree on those things. But here's the interesting thing. While we agree with those things and we think that that's the right way to live, we also know that most of the problems in the world are the fact that we don't actually live up to that. But why is it that we can think something is right, know that it's right, and yet we don't do it? How come actually universally people can think something's right or that would be better for the world, and yet we don't do it? What is it about the human heart? I mean, and any of you who have ever tried to, as a kid, right? I mean, you know this. As soon as you say, or let's just say this. those of us who want to diet, right? We say, I want to be fit, I want to be healthy. I know if I eat these things that'll be like bad for me and I will die. And guess what? What happens? You just stay away from them at Christmas and Thanksgiving, right? Easy peasy. I've never said that before. I just did. It's easy, right? No. Why isn't it? Because the Bible's answer is we're actually enslaved. We live under certain influences, what Paul calls the elemental powers of this world. It's interesting, the writer Aldous Huxley, he has this famous passage where he says, at university I became an atheist. And the real reason why I became an atheist, he admits, is because the fact of the matter is my religion was restrictive to the way that I wanted to act out my sexuality. He wanted to sleep around. He's honest. You know, there are certain things that drive us, and there are certain things that even if we don't want to do them, we do. And we can all think of those things. Why? Well, the Bible's answer is that sin is a power, and it gets a hold of your life, and it actually drives you. You might think, even if you have the will to do something, the question is, ultimately, what do you desire more? And you're going to be driven by those desires. You see, we're not free, we're enslaved. Furthermore, we all value certain things, right? Some of us value things like family, status, career, health. And we're all living, in a sense, for something or someone. Something gets us out of the bed in the morning. And these standards these values that we have, that we live for, well, first, they're mutually competing often, right? Think of it like this. You might want, you have envisioned a good life with career. You also want a spouse. But often, climbing ahead in your career and having a good family life don't go hand in hand. Right? And we make a choice at the end of the day, whatever we desire most, even if we want both. But even more than that, I think, we also know that these values, these things that we value, they start holding up or setting certain standards for us. We think, unless I achieve this level, then I'm not actually, I'm not actually worthy. I'm not worth something. We all know this, right? Because what happens? Like we say, let's say a standard of image, and we say, unless I get there, it's not enough. Career, unless I get there, it's not enough. Something. And when we don't meet these standards that these values set, when we don't have the perfect family life that maybe we want, or the career that we want, or whatever, when we don't meet them, what happens? We feel guilt, condemnation. Especially, what if somebody else has met them? I wanted to be this kind of lawyer, make this much money, and I'm only this kind of lawyer and only make this much money. And then what happens? We run into somebody who makes that much money and has achieved that, and what do we feel? Instant condemnation. This is what Paul's talking about, the power of the law. It's the power of the law that we are enslaved to. In all our relationships, we're acting out of it. I mean, if you look at any of your relationships that are kind of broken and fragmented, or just look at your relationships with your parents, oftentimes the things that are difficult there is that you're operating out of law. You feel a sense of condemnation, that you're not good enough. And Paul says this is a universal human condition. It's a condemning effect on our lives, and it separates our relationships, and it's also a power, because we feel like we have to live up to it. But then what happens? We actually achieve the career, and then we think, it's not enough. It's not enough. We have to have more. You see, Paul says what this suggests is that we are actually enslaved. Have you ever had someone point out your problems to you without providing a solution? How'd that feel? I mean, we all love constructive criticism, right? Yeah. No. We all love constructive criticism, and then somebody comes up and they're like, hey, Kyle, you're a really bad preacher. This wasn't very good. And I sit there and I'm like, oh, great, that's helpful. I love you. Keep saying that because you point out my flaws and I love it and it's great. No, we don't like it. Oh, but the truth spoken in love, right? No. Why? Because we feel condemnation. The condemning effects of the law are upon us, and we can say this in a multitude of areas, in a multitude of ways. So what keeps you up at night? What are the things that you're anxious over? I'd suggest that those are the things to which you are enslaved. Those are the things that, what do you feel a burden about, the condemnation? Those are the places where the law is actually acting in your life as a power, a condemning power. You go up to get the grade, and you're nervous, and it's a B- and your heart sinks. At the end of the year, you're given a report from a boss, and they have all these glowing things, but there's one check that's unsatisfactory. And your stomach ties in knots. It's the law. It's the condemning force of the law. What drives you? Acceptance of others? So we speak in such a way where everyone has to accept us, success, so we're willing to give up our health and everything else? Is it comfort? Is it safety? Is it image? I mean, you look at the problems people have, a problem like workaholism. What is it there? Something is driving that, even when you say it's wrong. Something's driving it. Is it comfort? Is it safety? Is it security? What is it? You see, we don't act out of just our own volition. We come enslaved. We are enslaved. So that's when he came. But what about how he came? Well, verse 4 tells us that when he came, he was born of a woman and he was born under law. First, he was born of a woman. Jesus Christ was fully human. That's what this is saying. See, the incarnation, this idea that God became human, this is the Christian teaching, and I don't have time to prove this to you now, but you just have to take it as read, that throughout the Scriptures you can see that the early Christians believed that Jesus was God. They believed that he was actually God. And so because of that, because they believed that he was God, they started worshiping him. See, but this idea that God became human, you're not going to find this in any other religion or any other place. It's crazy. Now think about this. God, when he came and he stepped into our world, didn't come as like a flash of light or an alien or something like that. He came as a human. And here's what that means. God is utterly, utterly relatable. You can relate with God. You can have a relationship with him. You can actually know him. You might think, well, I could do that without God becoming human. Yes, to a certain extent, but not as fully. I mean, you know this, right? I know we've got some pet lovers in the room, and you love your pets, right? And some of you would even go so far as to say you have a relationship with your pets. You know your pets, right? But do you know them the way that you could know another human being? Could you ever? No. You see, God became human so that we could actually relate to him, but he didn't just become human. He became vulnerable. When he took on flesh, he became actually vulnerable. He stepped into the mire and the muck. See, this isn't a distant God who is aloof to our problems. This is a God who gets his hands dirty in the mire and the muck, and the blood and the amniotic fluid. That's the kind of God we're talking about, and that means he knows what life is like here. He was tempted. He knows what it means to be sick. He knows what it means to suffer. He knows what it means to suffer hardship, isolation, to be marginalized. He knows these things. He's experienced these things. He's utterly relatable. He was utterly vulnerable to misunderstanding and even vulnerable to death. But not only was he vulnerable, that means he became utterly sympathetic. See, if you don't feel like you can relate to Jesus, that's okay, because Jesus can relate to you. He knows what you've been through. Do you know what it feels like to be depressed? He knows that. Do you know what it feels like to be lonely? He knows that too. Marginalized? He knows that. Misunderstood, he knows that. So you can go to him. There was several trials this year. We're coming to the end of the year, and we reflect back on the year, and especially these shows. And several trials that grabbed our attention. One was Amanda Knox in Italy, who was released. And folks said, well, what is she doing now? And her representative was asked, or maybe her father, I forgot, and he said, well, what she wants to do, because they were asking about, is she going to go back to school, or what's she going to do? What she wants to do now is she wants to actually, she wants to be an advocate for those who are wrongfully accused. An advocate for those who are wrongfully accused. You see, the Bible calls Jesus a wonderful counselor. He can be your advocate and the strongest advocate because he knows what you've been through. He's experienced it himself. But he's also the Prince of Peace. And there's not a place of unrest in your life, not a place of unrest in my life that he doesn't understand and that he's not going to bring healing to. So where does it hurt? Where have you felt broken? Where's there unrest in your life? Jesus came to bring healing to all those areas. One of the church fathers, Gregory of Nazareth, it's one of the Cappadocian fathers. Greg of, I want to say the other one. There are two Gregories, but Nazianzen said this. He said, "For that which he has not assumed, he has not healed. But that which is united to his Godhead is always saved." You see, because he was fully human, that means that he came to save the full range of your human experience and brokenness. Not one bit is going to be overlooked by him. But the text doesn't just say he was born of a woman. It also says he was born under law. See, he lived under the perfect standard that we live under. He knows the burden of the law and how difficult it is to keep. And he also knew guilt. The guilt of the law, the condemnation of the law, and the shame that we feel. He knows what it means to be under its condemning force. And you might say, well, wait a second. How is that? Well, he was condemned as a criminal. Wait, but why? I mean, I thought Jesus was supposed to be like a good guy, like the best guy, like he didn't do anything wrong. Well, that brings us to our last point, why he came. Why he came. Paul says he came to bring us freedom. Verse 5 tells us that Jesus came to redeem those who were under the law. This concept of redemption has its place. It would have been very familiar in the ancient world because slaves were everywhere, and this has to do with slave terminology. To redeem someone is to actually buy them out of slavery. Often in the ancient world, if you were to become a slave, it was because you either could not pay your debts or it was because you stole something and you were a criminal, and so the person who you offended, you would have to go work that off. So you would become their slave. But there was a possibility to purchase a slave, to redeem them. But in order to redeem them, you would actually have to pay the person who they owed debts to their debts. What is their contract? Let me pay it up. That's what it meant to redeem. And so we see that Jesus came and he was condemned by the law. That he suffered a criminal's death, that he died as an insurrectionist, the worst criminal. Why? Because he came to redeem those who were under the law. You see, he filled out our debt. He paid our debt. He felt the condemnation, the guilt, the shame, the crush of the law for us so that we wouldn't have to pay it. But he came not only to redeem us from slavery, he also came to bring us family. You know, there was one of the big concerns in the post-antebellum South was what's going to happen to these slaves who have now been released. Because, you know, it's not a very pretty thing just to release all these people into society who have no, home or no jobs or no way of getting those things, and they can't acquire anything. So what are we going to do? You see, I mean, if you just go and you're kind of a nomad, then you're basically, that's a form of slavery as well. But God didn't, when he releases us, when he brings us freedom, he doesn't just release us into unrelatedness. It says in verse 5, goes on to say that he came that we might receive the adoption as sons. He came to bring us into God's family. See, being free does not mean that we are on our own and we get to make whatever decisions we want. Being free, freedom is being in the right context. And the context brings us into is God's loving family. And so we read that we're delivered both from something, our sin and the powers of sin and the law, and to something, into God's family. And when God does this, verse 6, just in case we don't feel like a full family member, it says that God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts so that we cry out, Abba, Father. That we know that we're sons, that we cry out to God. See, God's intention was not just to invade the world. God's intention is to invade your heart, your life. The Son of God became the son of a woman so that sons of women might become, and daughters of women might become the sons and daughters of God. That's what this story is about. That's what Christmas is about. Jesus invading our world and also invading our hearts. See, Christmas means nothing for you except a couple days off if you just get that Jesus invaded the world. Unless he invades your heart. Unless he invades, that is, the biblical way of talking about the very center of your life. That's what you need. That's what needs to have. That's what you need to have happen. And when he does that, you'll have all you need. Because he didn't just come to bring us freedom, he didn't just come to bring us into a family, but he also came, Paul says, to bring us fortune. Look at verse 7. It says, you're no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. Perhaps you have heard the expression or the saying, or asked it yourself, or heard someone ask it, how did so-and-so make their money? Especially someone who has lots of money. They have a fortune. You know, how did they make their money? That's what you want to know. And our assumption is that actually, if you have a fortune, that you probably achieved it or someone did before you. They achieved that fortune, and then that was passed down to you or whatever. But somebody had to achieve this fortune. But you see, this story is not about us working our way up to heaven. This story is about a God who invaded our planet and our world. This story is not about a fortune, a salvation, an inheritance that is achieved. It's about one that is received, which is exactly why Paul says that we might receive the adoption as sons. You have to receive it. He has to invade your heart. He has to invade your life. Otherwise, it won't mean anything for you. But when he does, you will have all that you need because you will have him. And he is worth everything. Everything. Freedom. Freedom from sin. Freedom from the power of the law. Freedom from the condemning force of the law. Why? Because Jesus paid it. Freedom. Family. And an inheritance that will never pass away. Will you receive it? That's the question before you this evening. It's the question before me. Will we receive it? Amen.